It's Erev Pesach. We've just finished burning our chomets, so I thought it'd be a great opportunity to learn a little bit about the seder plate.
The first mention of a seder plate in halachic literature comes after the time of the Talmud, the Mishnah and the Gemara, and in the time of the Rishonim. We see the Rashbam, for example, in the 13th century, mentioning that it's important not just to have the items laid out on a table, but to have a special plate designated for putting them on.
The seder plate, or ka'ara in Hebrew, is simply a way of putting together the various food items we need for Seder night. Over the years, artistic license has given rise to a whole variety of Seder plate designs, some of which don't look anything like a plate. But all of them have the same basic function. There are different types of items on the Seder plate. The two roasted items, the egg and the shank bone, are there merely as symbols and aren't eaten. The karpas and the morah are dipped into the salt water and the charoses respectively, before and after the section of mugid. And last of all, of course, you have the matzah, which many keep separate away from the Seder plate. Now, of course, people from different cultures add more different items to their Seder plates. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to stick to these 6 or 7 items and discuss them in a little bit more detail.
Whilst we're waiting for the car to be cleaned, let's have a quick word about preparation. The best time to get the Seder plate prepared and to get all your things together is on Erev Pesach. I know it's last minute, but it just means that everything's nice and fresh for Seder night.
Karpas is normally a green vegetable. We use parsley, but there are other traditions to use celery or radish even, or potatoes, as long as it's a vegetable that can't be used for morah, so not romaine lettuce or horseradish. The word karpas comes from the Greek word meaning green vegetable. There is also, incidentally, a Farsi word, a Persian word, that has a similar meaning as well. And it's a sign of springtime.
Other explanations that are given for the karpas is that the Chasam Sofer points out that as well as matzah, the Jewish people would only be able to eat raw vegetables whilst they were slaves. So this could be perhaps another reminder of the servitude that we suffered in Egypt. The Ochos Chaim says perhaps they would use vegetables as a sort of balm to heal the wounds that were inflicted by the Egyptian taskmasters. Rashi compares the word karpas to a similar word that's used for a type of fabric and used to describe, of all things, Joseph's coat that famously his brothers dipped in blood as a way of showing their father Jacob that he had died. This event, this dipping, set in motion Jacob's eventual descent into Egypt, and so similarly this dipping at the Seder night kind of triggers off the whole Maggid section of the Haggadah. But the most common explanation is that it's a sort of springboard, a trigger for the kids to get them to ask questions, or get other people to ask questions, and to make them curious as to why we're doing this unusual activity before a meal. Not entirely happy with that answer though, because, well, what are you supposed to answer to the kids when they do ask? What is the point of the dipping? To me, it actually raises a fundamental point before we get into the Maggid section, before we actually ask the Manish Tana. And that is, well, not all questions do have answers. And sometimes we've kind of got to get on with life, just appreciating that we might not know the answer to all of our questions. We might find them out later on enough, with enough research and asking the right person. But we can't always expect to get the answers that we want to the questions we ask. And sometimes that's part of the challenge of being who we are.
Salt water, my melach in Hebrew, is there to remind us of the bitter tears that the Jews shed whilst they were enslaved in Egypt. We use salt water, but there are other traditions. Some use lemon juice or vinegar, anything that's got a bitter taste, that is something that we can dip into the karpas into early on in the seder service before we start mugging properly.
Here's the Beitza and the Zeroa, the egg and the shank bone. They're a little bit more complicated, so let's pop them in the oven for 20 odd minutes to roast, and we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail. The shank bone, or Zeroa, represents the Korban Pesach, the paschal sacrifice that Moses is told the Jewish people are to bring on the night of Pesach. In Exodus chapter 12, we read that on the 10th of Nisan, they are to set aside a lamb or goat, less than a year old, to be slaughtered 4 days later and eaten in its entirety before midnight that night, the night of Pesach. They were to daub the blood of the sacrifice on their lintels and doorposts as a way of showing that they had done this and eaten an animal that was held sacred in ancient Egypt. This procedure was later replicated by the Jews in temple times. Because it had to be eaten completely without any leftovers, many would group together and eat a single lamb together with matzah and maror, as a family or with groups of friends. And that explains the custom that many have for families and friends to get together on Seder night. It is called Zeroa in Hebrew to remind us of the Zeroa Natuya, the outstretched arm, which is used to describe the way God brought us out of Egypt. Next is Beitza, the roast egg. To understand this, we need to go into a little more detail about the sacrifices that were due on Pesach and the other pilgrimage festivals during temple times. For each of the three festivals, Pesach, Shavuos and Sukkot, every adult male Jew was obligated to come to the temple. And just like you wouldn't turn up as a guest at someone else's house without taking along a box of chocolates, we were commanded not to come empty-handed. We had to come with an elevation offering, called an olas riyah, an olah that was brought for appearing at the temple. This olah offering was completely burnt up on the altar, with none left to be eaten by the Kohanim or the person bringing the sacrifice. There is an additional obligation to celebrate on the festivals. And Jews being Jews, we celebrate through food. And sure enough, the Gemara in Chagiga, page 10, derives that one fulfills this obligation by bringing a peace offering, called a Shalmei Chagiga. The Shalmei Chagiga, or Chagiga for short, was brought on the first day of Yom Tov. Like other shlomim, or peace offerings, some of it was burnt on the altar, some of it was given to the Kohen, but, importantly, some of it was eaten by the person bringing the sacrifice in Jerusalem. In addition, as a top-up if you like, one could bring what was called Shalmei Simcha, shlomim peace offerings brought for the sake of enjoying the festival of Simcha. And it is those that would form the main constituent of the Seder night meal, or the meal on any other Yom Tov, come to that. The reason we have a special symbol of the Chagiga on Pesach, and not on other Yom Tovs, is that, unlike Shavuos and Sukkot, on Pesach, an extra Chagiga had to be brought on Erev Yom Tov to accompany the Korban Pesach. And it is that is symbolised by the egg on the Seder plate. And so your final shopping list for Pesach would look a little bit like this. Now let's go and see how that roast egg and shank bone are coming along. Okay, looks like they're ready. Nicely roasted egg and shank bone. Now we come on to maror, the bitter herb. The Torah tells us that the Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice, had to be eaten together with matzah and with maror. There are 5 vegetables listed in the Mishnah as being suitable for maror, 2 of which we use today. Romaine lettuce, or kos as it's sometimes called, or horseradish. And we can see horseradish growing here in our garden. Now I have to say, horseradish is always best when it's fresh, but it's well, horseradish and romaine lettuce as well. Not very resilient to the British climate, to changes in the frost and the snow and so on. Also, it has huge leaves, which make great fodder for caterpillars and snails and so on. It's a perennial plant, so it will grow back the next year if the conditions are right. But what I've done is I put aside a couple of shoots just to keep them in a pot away from the main bunch, just to hopefully stop the slugs and snails getting at the leaves, and maybe look after this one a little bit more, and protect it from the frost as well. Romaine lettuce for Mora, it's difficult to check for bugs. It's important not to have any bugs in it, so you do have to give it a jolly good rinse over and a good check beforehand. Nice big leaves, but do take your time over that because of all the different crevices and nooks and crannies on the leaves. I normally allow, to get the right amount, about 2 leaves per person. Don't forget you're going to have Mora twice, one at Mora and one at Korech, and then topping that up with a bit of the horseradish as well. The question you could ask is, why were the children of Israel themselves commanded to eat Mora, together with the paschal lamb and with the matzah? Surely, of all people throughout history, they more than anyone should have known about the embitterment and of the enslavement in Egypt. Well, the answer is that for many of them, that enslavement became a way of life. We are told that later on, during their wanderings in the wilderness, that many of the children of Israel looked back at their time in Egypt with nostalgia and fondness, that the Egyptians looked after them, fed them, gave them accommodation, albeit whilst they were being enslaved. So, for the children of Israel then, and for us now, we need to look back at those times as being something that was bad. Subordinating others and being subordinated ourselves is not something that is going to help us break free and move on. That is a step that needs to be overcome before we can do that. And the children of Israel needed to get beyond that, to be able to receive the Torah from Sinai and ultimately go on to the promised land of Israel and Canaan. So too with us, with our personal restrictions, our addictions, our compulsions, our dependency on others for our emotions. We need to move on from those, identify them as being non-desirous, as things that are holding us back, before we are able to move forwards and improve on ourselves. The Choresis reminds us of the cement that the children of Israel used whilst they were enslaved in Egypt. The word cheres in Hebrew means earthenware or clay. There are hundreds of different recipes for Choresis. There's 4 basic ingredients, and those are the 4 that we tend to use in our family. And that is apples, cinnamon, almonds and wine. In our family we use a lot of almonds because we're a family of Kohanim, and almonds are very much associated with Kohanim. If you remember in the story of Aaron's staff, it turns into an almond flour. And we also use a lot of wine. Although I never got a chance to ask my mum why she needed so much wine in the Choresis, and she seemed to enjoy eating it a lot. In terms of the actual recipe, as you can see here, you just basically peel and grate up the apples and mix in the almonds, cinnamon and wine to get the thick consistency that we can see here. Matzah on Seder night is there for 2 reasons. Firstly, on the night of the 15th of Nisan, the children of Israel were to eat the Paschal sacrifice, the Korban Pesach, together with Matzah and Mora. Now, we have the dispute with Hillel and the others whether or not those were eaten together in one go, as Hillel says, or whether they were eaten separately. But the 3 had to be eaten. Now, once that had happened, and that had to be eaten before midnight, they were then told to leave. And as they left, they had matzah left over. Or they had to bake additional matzah
or additional food for provisions for their journey. And that second round of matzah was matzah that didn't have time to rise because they had to leave in a hurry. Now the Haggadah gives that second reason as the reason for eating the matzah. And various reasons are given as to why. Primarily because we don't have the Paschal sacrifice nowadays, we don't have the temple nowadays.
Pesach, and Seder night in particular, is a unique opportunity for passing on to children and to others this magnificent story that we have of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. How we, as a people, starting out as a bunch of slaves submerged in the quagmire of Egyptian culture, emerged from Egypt and went on to receive the Torah at Mount Sinai and ultimately onto the promised land of Israel. It's a story that is truly ours, full of rich details and magnificent miracles. And it's one that we have a duty to pass on to the next generation, just as it's been passed on to us through the ages. It's a story that is rich in history and which various cultures have added in their own details, their own aspects of the Seder plate and the Seder service.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope it was useful to you. Have a great Yom Tov.